Exogenous ketones in pro cycling, an update on exercise performance and beyond. This is the main topic of today's episode, where I'll be joined by two researchers from the University of Leuven who have been performing some great research on the effects of exogenous ketone supplementation in exercise performance, recovery and overreaching, mostly with trained cyclists. So today I'm thrilled to be joined by Chiel Poffé and Peter Hespel. My apologies to the Dutch listeners for my lousy Dutch pronunciation. And today we'll be performing an update on this topic, which has been previously tackled here by Mark Evans back on episode 12 of the podcast. And thanks to both our guests' important research simulating competition-like scenarios for their studies and Peter's experience working directly with pro cyclists, we will try to provide you here with an applied view on this topic to find out where are we standing regarding exogenous ketone supplementation in regard to exercise performance, recovery, and in what context its use might be justified in pro cyclists. Let's find out right away on this episode 39, Exogenous Ketones in Pro Cycling, an update on exercise performance and beyond. Welcome to Feel the Pedal podcast. Bring in that guitar. Welcome back everyone to another episode of Feel the Pedal podcast. It has been a while since our last episode, but regardless of that, I'm still your host, Gabriel Martins, that Portuguese nutritionist broadcasting from Madrid, and once again trying to bring you interesting conversations with researchers and experts in areas related to sports nutrition with direct applicability to cycling and other endurance sports. It has been a while since our last episode with Dana Liss on collagen supplementation, but once again I would ask for your understanding, since Feel the Pedal is for the moment a hobby of mine, one that I love doing of course, but the time that I can dedicate to it is dependent on my work, ongoing PhD research and lecturing, which has been pretty intense in the past month. So it is to be expected that sometimes the episode scheduling becomes a bit irregular. Still, I will always do my best to try and keep this podcast alive. And to make it up to you, today's episode is a real treat. Today I'm glad to be joined by two Belgian researchers who have been producing some serious work at University of Leuven in Belgium with exogenous ketones, mostly on trained cyclists and triathletes, and we'll be presenting their data, and we'll be also touching on some very interesting findings on the transient yet important effects on the reduced muscle buffering capacity when providing ketones found by both Chiel and Peter. And please bear with me while I try to pronounce both our guests' names as best as I can, forcing whatever Dutch-speaking skills I don't have. So, briefly presenting today's guests, Chiel Poffé has a PhD in exercise physiology from the University of Leuven in Belgium, henceforth KU Leuven, working currently as a postdoc researcher in Professor Peter Hespel's lab. His research focuses on the role of ketone bodies in the physiological and muscular response to exercise and training. As for Peter Hespel, he's a full professor at KU Leuven, and he's also the head of KU Leuven Athletic Performance Center Bakala Academy. He's a consultant for the Belgium Olympic team, the Belgium national soccer teams, the Belgium Cycling Federation, the Koenig Quick-Step Pro Cycling team, as well as the Belgium 4x400 relay squads. Having guests such as these who have one foot on research and the other foot on the field allows us to get the best of both worlds and obtain a way more applied view on any specific topic, and today is one of those situations. Let us not forget that the best research questions come from working with athletes themselves. This talk today is also one of the topics to be presented on this year's IZANC conference, to be held online from the 15th to the 17th of December 2020. And on the 17th, Peter Hespel himself will be talking about the physiological effects of intermittent exogenous ketosis in endurance exercise performance, right after Louise Burks' talk about low-carb high-fat 2.0, periodizing ketogenic diets with carbs and ketone supplements. So if you're listening to this episode before the 15th December, you're still on time to register to listen to some of the best researchers in this area of sports nutrition. I am already registered and I can't wait to attend this year's IZANC. So I believe we're all set here. Let's jump right into today's talk with Chiel Poffé and Peter Hespel, I hope I got that right, to provide an update on exogenous ketones in pro cycling. up next on Fuel the Pedal podcast. And from Leuven, Belgium, we have with us Chiel Poffé, and I hope I pronounced it correctly. How are you, Chiel?
I'm doing pretty fine, thank you very much.
I am very pleased to have you here with us, Chiel, and also Peter Hespel. Welcome to Fuel the Pedal. It's an honor to have you here with us.
Thank you. Welcome.
Gentlemen, it's a pleasure to have you both on the podcast, and I'm really looking forward to chat with you about the use of exogenous ketones in cycling, which has been one of the main focus of your research group in the last couple of years. But before that, it's important to tell the listeners a bit about your background, both academic and more field-based, so that the listeners can understand what led you to start doing research on this topic. And I would start with you, Chiel.
So I'm Chiel Poffé, and I recently started as a postdoctoral researcher at the exercise physiology research group of Peter Hespel at KU Leuven. And at this university, I also obtained my PhD. And both during my PhD and also in my current position, my research focuses on ketone bodies and their role during exercise and training. And I first came into contact with these ketone bodies through my master thesis, which I also conducted under the supervision of Peter, and which focused on the acute effects of ketones on recovery after exercise. And personally, I always had a huge interest in exercise physiology because I'm a recreational long distance runner. So therefore, this really caught my interest to have a scientific career in exercise physiology.
That's terrific, Chiel. We can say that you've been running after this area, getting right onto it since your master's degree, PhD, and now postdoc position. So you have definitely a lot to tell us regarding today's topic. So I now turn to you, Peter. What can you tell us about yourself, your background, current relevant roles you'd highlight, and interests around this area of exogenous ketones?
I have been a professor in exercise physiology and sports nutrition at KU Leuven since 1990, I think. So it's a long time. And over that 30-year period, I have always been very interested in research addressing the impact of nutrition on training adaptation, mainly in endurance sports. And during that period, we have studied quite a lot of nutritional supplements like creatine, beta-alanine, but also how fasted training, for instance, can alter training adaptations in endurance training. And then one of the last research lines that started, I think, about 5 years ago was the role of ketones and the potential of exogenous ketone supplementation on training adaptation and endurance exercise performance. And that's in this research line that Chiel has been doing such excellent research. Besides research, I am also teaching exercise physiology and sports nutrition at students in physical education and physiotherapy. And besides that, I am pretty closely involved in working with athletes, not only, for instance, with the Koenig Quick-Step cycling team, but also with the Belgian Olympic team, like the Belgian Tornadoes, the 400-meter runners, but also triathlon. So I have always tried to make the link between applied sports sciences and exercise physiology and the field.
That's a long run indeed, Peter, and a lot of experience in this field that will certainly translate into a very interesting talk today for our listeners, providing an applied perspective on the role of exogenous ketones during exercise. So I believe we have the perfect mix today to talk about the science supporting the use of exogenous ketones and then the practical application to cycling, given your field-based experience with professional cyclists. After all, what we do here on the podcast is not only bring the true experts on their respective fields to present their research, but ultimately discuss the application to road cycling and other endurance-based sports. So back on episode 12 of the podcast with Mark Evans, we went through some of the basic aspects of achieving ketosis through a low-carb, high-fat ketogenic diet when compared to ingesting exogenous ketones. But since there may be some listeners who haven't had the opportunity to listen to that particular episode, perhaps a good place to start would be to tell the listeners a bit about the differences between diet-induced ketosis and ketosis induced by supplementing with exogenous ketones. Perhaps mentioning the different exogenous ketone formulas, doses often used in research, and what blood parameters should we expect to find elevated. So, Chiel, would you do the honors?
Okay, perfect. It is indeed really important to get a difference between the diet-induced ketosis and the exogenous ketosis, because it's often believed that those induce a similar effect, even identical, but this is definitely not the case. So with both a diet-induced ketosis and the exogenous ketosis, you will get an increase in ketone levels in the blood, but the way of achieving this ketosis is completely different. So with the diet-induced ketosis, you will simply reduce the ingestion of carbohydrates, for instance, by following a high-fat ketogenic diet or by starvation. And this will stimulate the liver then to generate ketones itself by converting free fatty acids. While with an exogenous way, you will increase the ketone levels in the blood simply by ingesting a ketone supplement. So, and due to the fact that with the diet-induced ketosis, so for instance by the ketogenic diet, you will also have not only the effect of the ketones, but also the effect of the high-fat diet. So as a result, for instance, during exercise, when following a ketogenic diet, you will double your fat oxidation and also reduce the oxidation of carbohydrates, while we observe that with a ketone supplement, you don't get this effect on substrate utilization. So with the ketone supplements, we can have the specific effect of the ketones, while with the diet-induced ketosis, you get the effects of the ketones, but also the effects of the lower carbohydrate intake. And then related with the exogenous ketones, so with the ketone supplements, you have generally three different categories. So first you have the ketone precursors, which include medium chain triglycerides and also butanediol. And these will trigger your liver to generate ketone bodies. But the problem with these type of ketogenic supplements is that, for instance, for MCTs, that they contain a huge amount of calories, and also that they are quite inefficient to really increase the ketone levels in the blood. Then besides those ketone precursors, we can also use ketone salts. So in this case, a ketone body is bounded by a salt, which is often sodium or potassium. And this then may also increase your ketone levels in the blood, but the increase is mostly quite modest. So you only get to maximal 1 millimolar. And then we have the third category, which is the ketone ester. So this is the most potent strategy to increase the ketone levels in the blood. So in this case, a ketone body, either by hydroxybutyrate or acetoacetate, is bound to a ketone precursor. Most often this is butanediol. And when you ingest only 25 grams of this ketone ester, you will get a ketone levels in the blood of 2 to 3 millimolar, which is comparable to a couple of days of fasting, or if you follow the ketogenic diet for 1 to 2 weeks. So with this ketone ester, this is really the most appropriate strategy to investigate the specific effects of the ketones itself without having the confounding effect of a ketogenic diet, for instance.
That was indeed a great initial overview, Chiel, to help us understand the differences between diet-induced and supplement-induced ketosis and the different formulas from which the ketone esters would be the most efficient way of increasing blood beta-hydroxybutyrate. But before turning to Peter, since we're going to be talking about supplementing with ketones not only before and during exercise, but also after exercise, could you please tell us a bit about these different doses, timing of supplementation, and also if you use single or split doses in each of those moments?
So we need to make the difference between during exercise and after exercise. So if we give the ketone ester after exercise, we give 25 grams immediately after each training session and also 30 minutes before sleep. While during exercise, we give, for instance, during a simulated cycling race of 3 hours, we give 3 doses of 25 grams of the ketone ester. And with the ketone ester, you get an increase in the ketone levels within less than 30 minutes. And after 3 to 4 hours, the ketosis is gone.
Thanks for clarifying that, Chiel. So now I turn to you, Peter. Some of your initial research with supplemented exogenous ketones showed promise in stimulating mTORC1 in myotubes after a glycogen-depleting exercise. Could you tell us a bit more about this initial research and also perhaps summarize for the listeners how has the knowledge of exogenous ketone supplementation evolved since then so we can tackle each of one of those topics throughout this interview?
The reason to run our first study with the ketone ester in 2016, because we published that paper in 2017, was that in some of the research by Kieran Clark's group in Oxford, it was suggested that the ingestion of the ketone ester post-exercise would stimulate muscle glycogen repletion, which is of course extremely important, for instance, in Grand Tour cycling, because any strategy that would facilitate the repletion of muscle glycogen between the stages could help next day performance. And in that study, contrary to the expectations, we did a glycogen depleting exercise. And then during the recovery for 5 hours, we administered several doses of the ketone ester in conjunction with recommended dosages of carbohydrates and protein. And that's an important one because throughout all our studies, we always have tried to copy-paste relevant nutritional conditions for a cyclist. We could have administered only the ketone ester in the recovery period, but that's not a situation you want to be in because no athlete will use it in recovery. So we administered recommended dosages of carbohydrates after glycogen depleting exercise, plus recommended dosages of protein, plus the ketone ester, and compared it with the placebo. And we found no effect at all on muscle glycogen resynthesis, but we saw a stimulation of mTOR, a molecule that plays a pivotal role in regulation or stimulation of muscle protein synthesis. So for us, that was the first indication that exogenous ketosis could play a role in recovery after exercise. But in order to make more clear conclusions about the relevance of this mTOR stimulation in recovery, I think we need more studies, because what we showed is that ketone ester intake after exercise stimulates mTOR, but we do not yet know whether this translates or this eventually translates on the long term in enhanced muscle protein synthesis and in enhanced muscle functional proteins. So we know something about stimulation of mTOR, but we definitely need more studies to see how this could impact on muscular adaptations during training.
Some really interesting points there regarding what's still left to be done regarding the effects of exogenous ketones on muscle protein synthesis. And I believe your efforts in trying to mimic the conditions we could find in a race is notable throughout your research. And it is to be applauded, of course, because it brings us closer to understand if these strategies would be effective in such scenarios. So rather than just providing the ketone ester alone, you've given it alongside the recommended amount of carbohydrate and protein for muscle glycogen repletion. And we'll come back to this point when we talk about some of your other studies where you've tried to mimic what happens before and during racing by providing ketones on top of a high carbohydrate diet. So, following the chronological order of your publications, one of your following studies after the one we've just mentioned had to do with the possible effects on preventing functional overreaching or overreaching symptoms, which could result in performance decrements, as showed in your published research on the Journal of Physiology. And I believe this was Chiel's first research on this topic, so no one better than you to tell us all about it, what you've done, and what may be the practical implications of it.
Yeah, this was indeed my first study, so really nice to start with such a study in my PhD. So this study was based on the observation in our first study, so the study that Peter just mentioned. And we thought that the most beneficial way of having ketones to stimulate performance would not be during exercise, but might be after exercise, as if it might stimulate mTORC, for instance, after exercise. But there were also some other preliminary evidences that they might impact on symptoms related to overtraining, such as on the autonomic neural system. So therefore, we thought that ketones might help to stimulate recovery after exercise and to perform better on the day after. So to investigate this, we recruited 18 healthy subjects, and they had to perform a 3-week overload training. And during these 3 weeks, they had to perform a cycling session twice a day for 6 days per week in order to get them developing overreaching symptoms. And during this overload training period, all subjects received a standardized amount of carbohydrate and protein after exercise, which is according to the state of the art, as mentioned by Peter, as we always try to mimic real-life conditions. And then in addition, half of the subjects received 25 grams of the ketone ester immediately after each training session, as well as 30 minutes before sleep, while the other half received an isocaloric placebo. And then the results were really surprising for us. So we observed first the training load. So the training load gradually increased during these 3 weeks. And at the final week, the training load was supramaximal. So some subjects had to lower their training load. And we observed that the ketone ester group was able to tolerate a 15% higher training load compared to the placebo group. So this really suggests that the ketones were performing better than the placebo group. And then even more interesting were the changes that we observed in some symptoms of overreaching. So in the placebo condition, we observed, for instance, a decrease of approximately 20 beats per minute in the maximal heart rate, while in the ketone ester group, heart rate dropped only half the extent of the heart rate drop in the control group. And also in the placebo group, we observed that there was a gradual increase in adrenaline secretion during the night, while this was not the case in the ketone ester group. So it was not only the performance that increased with the ketone ester, but also there was less evidence for overreaching symptoms.
Really interesting findings, no doubt, Chiel, which may have set a new direction for future research with practical implications for endurance athletes engaged in this sort of periods with a high training load, or even cyclists looking forward to recover from a multi-stage racing. And Peter, this particular research received some criticism at the time by a group of authors stating that the interpretations from this present study could be overly optimistic, and another group stating that subjects were not in a state of non-functional overreaching but were only functionally overreached, which you then went on to provide a reply to those comments on that same journal. And since all of these comments and replies are published, and in order to clarify the listeners on this topic, I think this could be a good opportunity to have you share your thoughts on these pieces of criticism around your research.
Okay, thank you. Well, one point is it's always nice to get criticism on the research because it proves it's being read and it has impact on the field. But of course, we have to try to understand the criticism. And one of the major criticisms was that we did not standardize the food intake during the 3-week overload training period. And this was again an explicit choice we made not to do it, because everybody involved in Grand Tour cycling knows that one of the big problems that riders experience is that due to the fatigue and the exhaustion, towards the end of a Grand Tour, the appetite decreases, they may start eating less, and this per se is an important reason for decrease in exercise performance. So we did not want to have a standardized diet because we wanted the subjects to have a spontaneous eating behavior. And very intriguingly, without us giving any recommendations on a nutritional intake, besides the intake of the ketone ester immediately after training and the ingestion of recovery shake, but all other meals were free, we could see that the subjects on the ketone ester were able to almost perfectly match their energy intake with the energy expenditure in training. And it's interesting to see that throughout the 3 weeks training period, the training load increased gradually by about 30%. And the subjects on the ketones, they spontaneously increased their energy intake by 30% over the 3-week period. Whilst in the placebo group, the energy intake was constant over the 3 weeks, which means that they developed an energy deficit. To me, this is already an important message to the field, because this shows that when riders get in a catabolic state due to endurance exercise overload, the administration of a ketone ester can help to match the energy intake to the energy expenditure in competition or training. Only this finding for me was worth doing the study. And because of the fact that we did not standardize the food intake, we got the criticism that most, maybe all the other findings, the physiological findings we have, may have been due to the difference in energy intake between the group rather than due to the administration of the ketone ester. And I have to contradict that, because if you look at all the physiological changes in that study, most physiological changes, and I mean the difference between the placebo and the ketone ester, started in the first week of the training overload, whilst the energy intake difference between the groups only occurred from week 2. So by no way the difference in energy intake could have been the only cause of the difference in the physiological adaptations, like the higher heart rate in the ketone group, the lower levels in the blood of growth differentiation factor 15 and some other parameters. This was clearly due directly to the intake of the ketone ester. A last point of criticism was the degree of training overload. And when commenting on that, I like to mention the opinion of Inigo Mujica, which you probably know, an expert exercise physiology, also very much involved in sports and endurance sports. And he's an expert in overtraining. And every presentation, he starts with a slide showing 2 chimpanzees. And he comments that overtraining, it's the real overtraining syndrome. It's not something real in sports. You can almost only get into a real state of overtraining when you have a stupid trainer and a stupid athlete that are not aware of any symptom of overtraining or training overload. So what we really wanted to do is contribute to find symptoms that occur very early in an overload period, to be able to anticipate on potential non-functional overreaching. And I think that's exactly what we did with our study, because from the start of the training overload, we could see some symptoms occurring that are very typical for endurance training overreaching, like a drop in heart rate at rest, at maximal exercise and maximal exercise. And very early in the ketone administration period during the training, we saw that ketone administration really helped to prevent the development of these overreaching symptoms. So I think that in that study, there is plenty of evidence to believe that ketone ester intake is really impacting in a positive way on the recovery process and may indeed contribute to prevent overreaching. And another important thing is we also measured the activity of the adrenergic system overnight. And we found there that during the ketone administration period in conjunction with overload training, in the placebo group, we got a gradual increase of the overnight adrenergic activity from week 1 to week 3. And in the ketone ester group, urinary excretion of catecholamines reflecting overnight adrenergic activity was stable. So this is a very clear indication that ketone ester intake during training overload can even impact on the development of hyperactivity of the adrenergic system at night, and I anticipate that there may be even an impact on sleep quality, and I think we need to do more studies in this regard.
Well, I think that at least for anyone listening to this episode now, we all have a clearer understanding of what you've tried to do and the fair conclusions you drew out of your results. But I would insist in what you've said in the beginning regarding the importance of receiving comments on published research, which is no doubt something that helps science grow and gives us a platform to debate ideas and perhaps shape future research.
Absolutely.
So for that reason, I'm really glad that we have brought up these comments and replies to your research that often slip away unnoticed in most articles. So still, Peter, this is a topic where people tend to have radical ideas about following a ketogenic diet and perhaps also anything related to exogenous ketones or the name ketones. So do you think there is a risk that people who may not understand the context which we are carefully discussing here would be tempted, as always, to extrapolate these findings? So do you believe there is something we can do to minimize that?
Yeah, it's very clear that our publication and some earlier publication by Oxford have made exogenous ketosis to become a hype. And a hype is never good because people start to use ketone esters completely out of context. And one important remark is that one should never ever just extrapolate findings obtained in less trained volunteers to world-class elite athletes. So all our studies are being done in well-trained volunteers with some spectacular results. It's very unsure that all these results can just be extrapolated to elite athletes like riders in the Tour de France. So we need more studies in elite athletes to understand how elite athletes respond to exogenous ketosis and how it might impact training adaptation in them. When it comes to recovery, we also have to understand that the conditions we created in our study were very extreme. We submitted well-trained volunteers with a good but not an excellent endurance training background to excessive training, containing 2 training sessions per day, 6 days per week for 3 weeks. So it's a very sudden increase in training load. This is not a type of training load that recreational athletes would normally be exposed to.
Sure.
So everybody who would follow such training program doesn't understand a lot of training, because the aim of our training program was to overload. That's not something you want to do. And we have no idea at present that if you follow a well-balanced endurance training program, what in such condition are the effect of exogenous ketones? We have no idea.
An excellent remark, Peter, and one that we could surely apply to many other situations and research with dietary supplements, no doubt. And this leads us to a research I've been keen to ask you about, since it clearly displays your hard effort in simulating the conditions that we would see in pro cyclists before racing if we wanted to test whether a ketone ester supplement would increase performance and exert an effect on glycogen sparing capacity on top of a high carb provision. And for that you provided subjects with a high carb dinner plus a carbohydrate-rich meal pre-exercise alongside with 60 grams per hour during the trial, which not only had a 3-hour intermittent cycling protocol, but also had a 15-minute time trial approximately and a sprint at the end. So quite similar from what we could expect from a competition-like scenario in terms of carbohydrate ingestion and exercise simulation. And this is the one research I've mentioned in the beginning where you found an increased metabolic acidosis with the ketone supplement. But Chiel, I will let you tell us everything about it. So could you go through this research? What findings did you expect regarding muscle glycogen sparing? And were you surprised by your own findings?
We're definitely surprised about the results. So as a starting point for this study, we used a seminal publication from the group of Kieran Clark at the University of Oxford. So they showed that when ingesting the ketone ester, you will reduce the muscle glycogen breakdown. So you will spare muscle glycogen. So if you would translate this to a race, it would be beneficial to ingest ketones during a low to moderate intensity phase of the race in order to preserve your muscle glycogen. But this would not be beneficial during the high intensity phase of a stage in which you simply need muscle glycogen to generate your ATP. So therefore, our opinion was if we would provide ketones during a cycling race, we need to give the ketones only during the initial phase when athletes are exercising at submaximal intensities. So therefore, in our study, we tried to mimic a real cycling race, which consisted of 3 different parts. First, they performed a 3-hour intermittent exercise bout, which was submaximal. And thereafter, they performed an all-out time trial of 15 minutes and in the end, a maximal sprint. And during this race, the subjects received 60 grams of carbohydrates per hour in order to simulate real conditions. And then we also provided ketones before and at the beginning of the race in order to get a ketosis during the first part of the race. And the idea behind this was that if we give ketones only during the initial phase, we can spare muscle glycogen and as such have higher muscle glycogen content by the start of the time trial. And then because we don't provide ketones anymore, we can use this muscle glycogen during the time trial and have a better performance. But then when we looked at the results, we did not observe any sparing of muscle glycogen due to the ketones. And because we thought that this muscle glycogen sparing will cause an increase in performance, we observed that there was no increase in performance because there was no effect on muscle glycogen. So we were really surprised because in the paper from the University of Oxford, they really showed that there was some muscle glycogen sparing during exercise, while we did not observe this. This is most likely due to the fact that we provided ample carbohydrates during exercise. So we provided 60 grams carbohydrates per hour, while in the study from Oxford, the cyclists were in a fasted state. And also the ketone ester condition in their study received a lower amount of carbohydrates. So maybe this can be the reason why we observe such different results compared to their study.
Well, I can only imagine how difficult it was and how long it must have taken you to perform the study with such conditions. And Peter, I would now turn to you so we can get deeper into this finding of yours regarding this increased metabolic acidosis that could potentially impair muscle buffering capacity, which has led you to publish 2 studies on medicine and science and sports and exercise, where you went on to provide sodium bicarbonate alongside with ketone ester to see whether this simultaneous supplementation could rescue this impairment on muscle buffering capacity, which by doing so not only increased blood bicarbonate concentration in one of those studies, but was also able to increase mean power output during time trial. So, Peter, could we perhaps say that this may be one of the main reasons why we don't see much of a performance improvement with a ketone ester on top of a high carb provision?
Well, when we started the first study on acute intake of ketone esters during exercise with the simulated cycling race, the results Chiel has been talking about, we were very much hoping to get a positive result on glycogen sparing and performance, of course, because any researcher doing a study wants positive results. But it was not the case. The results were completely negative. And maybe that was good because these data have probably stopped the hype at least a little bit, especially in recreational cyclists and other athletes, I think. So if I analyze the acute studies we have done this far, it is very, very clear that we have not seen any situation where during administration of recommended amounts of carbohydrates to stimulate endurance performance, the situation where the ketone ester enhanced performance. Not a single situation. What we have consistently seen is that when one ingests the ketone ester during exercise, you create a transient acidosis. And logically, acidosis, when you think about it, you anticipate that if this has an effect, it will be a negative effect during all our exercise. And that's why we believed that a potential positive effect of ketone esters on endurance performance might be counteracted by the acidosis due to the ketone ester intake. So we gave the bicarbonate, and indeed we saw that the ketone ester alone did not have any beneficial effect on performance, but when it was co-ingested with bicarbonate, then there was a positive effect at the end of a simulated cycling race. And this was very remarkable because at the end of that cycling race, the ketone body levels in the blood had returned to normal. So there were no more ketone bodies to be oxidized, for instance, during that final phase of the simulated cycling race. But still, the performance was enhanced by about 5%. We have no explanation yet on this effect because it cannot be directly due to the presence of ketones during the final phase of the race because there were almost no ketone bodies in the blood. So it must be due to some effects that occur earlier in the race. And we think about the impact of ketones on regulation of cation fluxes in muscle cells, because we saw some difference in sodium and potassium, but I think we have to do more research there to be able to make any reasonable conclusions.
Peter, one of your additional analyses you've performed in this study, and that I think it would be also interesting to talk about as well, was the measurement of gastrointestinal distress in the subjects, something that has been known to occur with some exogenous ketone formulas. And on top of that, you've given sodium bicarbonate, so another known supplement to cause GI distress. I wonder what were the effects of this mix?
When it comes to gastrointestinal effects, everybody who has ever used the ketone ester knows that the taste is very bad to disgusting, so it's not pleasant to use it. And some subjects even get gastrointestinal upset just by putting the ketone ester in the mouth or smelling it even without ingesting. So it's a substance that is potentially very aggressive for the gastrointestinal system. Nonetheless, I think now we have done probably 50, 60 subjects with high dose ketone ingestion during exercise, and the incidence of gastrointestinal problems was very low. If we had 12 subjects in a study using the ketone ester, we had no serious gastrointestinal symptoms and maybe light to moderate symptoms in 1-2 subjects, but not more. And even the addition of bicarbonate, which is also a dangerous molecule to cause gastrointestinal problems, when we had the combination of the bicarbonate with the ketone ester, even then the incidence of gastrointestinal symptoms was really reasonable, not to say low. And this is also probably the reason why it made it possible to have an enhanced performance at the end of a 3.5-hour cycling race in a 30-minute time trial.
Sure, otherwise it would have been difficult. And how about appetite suppression? This is something that I intend to get into later on, but did you see any changes in that particular study?
Well, the appetite suppression is a difficult issue because the results we have thus far are seemingly contrasting, because in the long term, the training overload study, in fact, we saw that in this training overload study, the intake of ketone ester stimulated the appetite because the subjects were spontaneously eating more and get a good match between energy expenditure and energy intake. But in the acute studies, we rather saw that after exercise, we had a small suppression of the appetite. But if this would ever result in, let's say, a more slow recovery of glycogen stores due to less intake of carbohydrates or nutrients containing carbohydrates and protein, I do not want to make that conclusion yet, because the effects on appetite were minor.
Mm-hmm. That's a very interesting observation. So it would seem that providing ketones in a chronic pattern, such as in your overreaching study, could stimulate the appetite, but in more acute studies, you see a slight appetite suppression. But whether this could affect food consumption to a point that keeps the riders from following the glycogen replenishment recommendations in a Grand Tour, for example, remains to be seen, but nonetheless, it's an important factor to keep an eye out for. Still, as you've just mentioned, the effects on appetite are minor. So, Chiel, it's been a while since you've last spoke to me. Your turn now, and I would insist on this finding of increased acidosis, but now I would refer to your second study where you've also provided sodium bicarbonate alongside a ketone ester supplement as well. So I will let you talk now and tell us the difference between this study and the first one.
So really important is the difference between the both studies that we did. So in the first study with ketones and bicarbonate, we provided the ketones mentioned by Peter only during the first phase and not during the high intensity phase. While in the second study, we provided the ketones during high intensity exercise. So just during a 30-minute time trial. And it seems that the effect during maximal exercise is completely different than the effect during submaximal exercise. So in the first study, we had no effect of the ketones, while in the second study, during high intensity exercise, we had a negative effect of ketones. So in that study, the ketones really decreased exercise performance. And there are also some differences, for instance, in blood lactate concentrations. So when we provide the ketones only during submaximal exercise, there was not really a huge effect on blood lactate. While if we provide the ketones during high intensity exercise, there was a decrease in blood lactate concentration. So this really indicates that the effects during maximal exercise are quite different than the effects during submaximal exercise. So therefore, I think next studies should definitely have a look, for instance, at muscle glycogen breakdown, the effect of ketones on that during maximal performance. And also something remarkable about these studies was that if we provide the ketones together with the sodium bicarbonate, we get higher ketone concentrations in the blood compared to the ketone ester condition alone. So co-ingestion of bicarbonate really increases the ketone levels in the blood, but we have no idea about the specific mechanism behind this. So I think future research should definitely have a look at this and also what impact it may have on performance.
That's remarkable indeed. So providing sodium bicarbonate on top of exogenous ketones allows for a superior increase in blood ketone levels than just with ketones alone. So perhaps we are already providing ideas here for future formulations. Nevertheless, the effects of maximal versus submaximal exercise and the moment of ketone provision, as you've mentioned, appear to have a lot to say in this matter, as both your research on MSSE shows. So, taking into account all the aspects we've been talking about regarding exercise performance and other aspects regarding overreaching or prevention of overreaching, which might also impact recovery, as you've mentioned, Peter. So, based on this, do you believe there is enough evidence to support the use of exogenous ketones in pro cycling teams, whether it is during recovery from high-intensity training blocks or during a Grand Tour?
Well, maybe I should answer your question first by repeating something I have said earlier, that one should never just extrapolate observations in less trained individuals to elite athletes. Having said this, I think that the data we have shown in our training overload paper in 2019 are so extremely clear in showing that the ingestion of ketone ester after every training session and just before sleep during a period of, overtraining that brings the body into a catabolic state, that in such condition, the ketone ester may help to prevent deterioration of the body and deterioration of performance. So yes, I believe that in the specific context of, for instance, a very hard training camp where you have a very rapid sequence of training sessions, one following after the other, with very high loads in very short periods of time, bringing the body in a catabolic state, that this may help to stimulate recovery and enhance the output of a training camp, for instance. Same is true, I think, for the Tour de France. But still, one should always tune the use in the individual athlete. And it's not because that in a group of less trained individuals we find some effects, that these effects will appear in every single athlete. But to me, it's certainly worthwhile to try it. And given that there is no reason to put the ketone ester supplement on the WADA list for whatsoever, it's not on the list and there are no reasons to do it. I think it's even an intelligent choice for an elite athlete to try it during a period of training overload, at least in endurance sports.
Well, according to that logic, we should also ban sodium bicarbonate, beta-alanine, nitrates,
and creatine and caffeine.
Yes.
So if we ban the ketone esters, then we have to ban a whole series of supplements, even the amino acids.
Even
and
amino
leucine.
acids.
Yeah.
No doubt. Peter, I would just insist in another point, and this is something that Chiel has briefly touched on already, but I want to have your take on this as well. Does the ingestion of exogenous ketones, in particular ketone esters, have the potential to impair carbohydrate oxidation during exercise?
I think one of the first hypotheses that was raised by the Oxford study was that when one ingests ketone ester before and during exercise, the ketone bodies partially replace carbohydrates as an energy substrate for the muscles. I think since about 1 month, we know that it's probably not the case because Oxford has repeated a similar study and they have shown that the contribution of the ketone ester in energy metabolism is minor. And there is another excellent study published by the group of John Holloway in Journal of Physiology on isolated mitochondria, showing that the effect or the way or that ketone esters are only marginally used by mitochondria in oxidative metabolism. So I think we have to leave the idea that ketone bodies can serve as a kind of super fuel for skeletal muscles during exercise. And I don't believe that they would inhibit carbohydrate oxidation because they are not really oxidized during the exercise, the ketone bodies.
I'm so glad I've done this question. That label of superfuel has been going on for a while now, and let's hope your statement here can contribute to clarify this one once and for all. So, Chiel, so far until now, we've been talking about exogenous ketone supplementation in the context of exercise performance and substrate utilization during exercise, but their role might go beyond these outcomes, and we're perhaps just barely starting to grasp the surface regarding other health-related issues, cognitive function, and even appetite suppression. Chiel, do you believe that there is indeed a potential for exogenous ketones in such areas?
Yeah, today, most of the research still focuses on ketones and their role as a potential energy substrate. But ketones are also a signaling metabolite, which have really numerous effects. So, for instance, also on muscle regeneration, also the effects that we see on the autonomic nervous system. So, this signaling effect will be of way more significance than the effect of ketones just as an energy fuel. So therefore, we need to focus much more on this signaling effect. And besides that, also there is some promising results in more clinical situations. So for instance, in catabolic diseases or also in more neurological diseases such as Parkinson or epilepsy, there are really promising data, and this is of way more significance than the effects pure on exercise performance. So it would be really interesting to see in the next years studies really focusing on a clinical situation and also to start unravel the signaling effect of the ketones.
Looking forward to that research as well. Peter, would you like to add anything to this?
Yeah, I think Chiel has said quite the most important point. I think what I could add is that what we certainly still need to do is learn to know how the use of ketone ester in a well-balanced training program may impact on training adaptation. We have some data, preliminary data, to indicate that the use of ketone ester during training may really have an impact on the muscular, the changes in skeletal muscle induced by a training program. And I think we may get some interesting data there on the short term. The second point is that in many athletic populations, the very intense training is combined with weight loss. And very often this results in a catabolic state, and especially in females, even in eating disturbances and anorexia. And I think there must be a potential of ketone ester to have some beneficial effect in counteracting the potential detrimental effects on health in such very catabolic situation when strenuous training is combined with hypocaloric diets.
Wow, I hadn't thought about that potential effect on such catabolic situations like eating disorders and situations of relative energy deficiency in sport, which is a topic that has started to be recently more often debated and brought to everyone's attention. And it's good to know that there may be some potential in those type of situations.
That's a scenario that occurs in many sports, weight class sports, rowing, ski jumping, cycling, marathon running. So the combination of strenuous training with hypocaloric diet is almost inherent to any sport.
Absolutely. Those are all sports that are at an increased risk of low energy availability through that combination of extraneous training with an hypocaloric diet. And since our time is short and I didn't want to have you leave without talking about this, there is some recent data from Professor Louise Burks' lab about the use of exogenous ketones on top of a low-carb, high-fat ketogenic diet, and this constitutes another context that would be interesting to debate here. So the authors went on to determine if a low-carb, high-fat diet plus a ketone ester supplementation could synergistically alter exercise metabolism and improve performance using a ketone monoester supplement in elite race walkers using a dose of 573 milligrams per kilo of body mass. And it turned out that the low-carb, high-fat diet elevating resting circulatory blood ketone levels, but concentrations following supplementation did not differ from the earlier ketone trial. Race performance was impaired by 6% relative to baseline in the low-carb, high-fat group, but it was unaltered in the high carbohydrate group. So, based on this and in your experience as well, what would be your comments on supplementing ketones on top of a 5-day ketogenic diet as shown in this recent research?
Well, I'm happy you are talking about the novel data by Louise, because we still had some questions related to the potential of ketone ester intake during exercise, because in our studies, as emphasized earlier in this discussion, we have always chosen to use recommended rates of carbohydrates before and during exercise. So we had no idea that if people are not using recommended rates of carbohydrates and, for instance, shift to a ketogenic diet or do exercise in the fasted state with depleted liver glycogen stores and maybe even low muscle glycogen stores, what will be the impact of ketone ester intake in such conditions? And as you say, the new study by Louise seems to show that even when you are on a short-term or longer-term ketogenic diet, of which we might believe that it might open a condition for ketone utilization as an energy substrate by the muscles, that this does not occur, and that even in such condition, there is an impaired performance. Mm-hmm. So also this road of ergogenicity of ketone esters is cut. The only situation where that we still need to do studies on is exercise in the fasted state. Because in exercise in the fasted states, especially if you are unexperienced, you may get in early hypoglycemia. And when in such condition you have high circulating ketone bodies in the blood, you might have a beneficial effect of the ketone bodies on central fatigue. Mm-hmm. So there still may be a role in fasted training, and of course not in fasted competition, because one never wants to do a competition in a fasted state.
And hopefully our talk here contributes to open those future avenues in future research. And speaking of which, Chiel, what take-home messages would you like to leave us with regarding the state of the research with exogenous ketones in general, and also research you would like to see performed over the next decade?
So first of all, I think we should really stress that we're only at the start of uncovering the specific effect of ketones on exercise performance, and we definitely need many more studies to investigate the specific conditions under which ketones may be beneficial or may be detrimental. So today it seems that if ketones can help an athlete to perform better, it's mostly if they are used as a recovery drink rather than be used during exercise or before exercise. But definitely we need also more studies to know what ketones really do. So today we know that if you ingest ketones during exercise compared to rest conditions, you have lower concentrations of ketones in the blood, but we still don't know where these ketones go to, so where they are metabolized or what is their specific role. So I think in the next decade, we really need to have more tracer studies, which really try to understand what happens with the ketones when you ingest them. So by which organs they are metabolized and how the ketones specifically work. So we really don't know many yet about what a ketone specifically does. And then I also think we need many more studies focusing on the signaling effects, and we should rather stop focusing purely on their effect as a potential energy substrate.
Let's bring in those tracer studies and more focus on signaling effects and much less on their role as a potential energy substrate. How about you, Peter? What would your final messages be?
Yeah, I think there is little to add because Chiel has made an excellent summary. Maybe one thing to add is that with the data that are currently available, I think there is not really a reason for recreational athletes to use ketone esters. Not before exercise, not during exercise, and not even during recovery, because recreational athletes, they never ever have the very high training loads that we have used in our study. So the main application to me today is potential enhancement of recovery and prevention of a catabolic state and overreaching in elite athletes, especially endurance athletes. And for the rest, I think research is too much in its infancy to promote the use of ketone esters.
Outstanding points by both of you, and hopefully we can see the research lean towards some of those points. So, Chiel, if people want to get in touch with you or follow your social media contents, where should we send people to?
So people can always just send me an email, to chiel.poffé@kuleuven.be, or on Twitter, just Chiel Poffé. You can easily find me.
Mm-hmm. How about you, Peter? Are you a social media person?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter under my name, @Peter Hespel. So any message I get on Twitter, I give a reply.
And as always, I will include the links to your profiles on the show notes for this episode 39. Gentlemen, this has been a true honor. This was a fantastic display of your remarkable research over these past years. So allow me to congratulate you and thank you both for your time to be here. Chiel.
It was really a pleasure for me to have this interview. Thank you.
Oh, Chiel, it was great to have you here with us. And Peter, thank you so much for your time and precious insights from both your experience and research. I hope you've enjoyed being on Fuel the Pedal.
Sure, I did. And I hope the listeners will learn something about the analysis Chiel and myself have made in this podcast.
I'm sure we all learned a lot from you. I know I have. Gentlemen, thank you again for your time, and I hope to talk to you soon. Thank you for getting this far on this episode. I hope you have enjoyed this talk with Chiel Poffé and Peter Hespel. Again, I hope that I'm close to the correct pronunciation. Once again, thank you for tuning in, and I hope to have you here on the next one. Take care, guys. Over and out.